in ways which don't require as much simplification, in ways that recognize the true complexity of the world. You may be able to share the way we think about the world.
So our first and primary objective here today is to have fun. Enjoy this wonderful session. And I am joined today by three distinguished colleagues. First of all, we have Dr. Matthew Farber from Northern Colorado University. He is an expert on games and learning and all sorts of interesting things. Then behind him, we have Vishnu Agnihorty, who has done a great deal of work assessing national standards and throughout the country of India, and he'll tell you more about what he does. And then we have from Sweden, Tobias Krantz, who has worked as a politician and also engages in national level educational policy and assessment and all sorts of very interesting things. So I'm going to begin by letting each person tell you a little bit about their work in greater detail, and then we will move from there. Hello, hello. Yeah.
Good morning. Good afternoon. Does this work? I can't even get to my computer. In the School of Teacher Education. And just to frame where I'm at in assessment, this is something called Games and Assessment, or GBA, Game-Based Assessment, right? And just to frame some of where we are, because there have been a lot of talks about AI so far in the conference. And this is a model from 2015 called Balanced Design Lens for Games. So basically the idea is that what you do in a game, the tasks you do in a game, can be, should be what you're learning. So it needs to be aligned. So that game over there is called Dragon Box Algebra 5+. That's how my son learned algebra at age 5, in theory. The mechanic is canceling and balancing using cards, and then the computer can assess where you are in that program, right? Because it's a computer, so they take that data. In fact, these are my students playing a game when I was a middle school teacher back a few years ago, playing SimCity EDU, and what this game is SimCity, a very popular commercial game, retrofitted by psychometricians from Pearson and ETS, the makers of the SAT test, and they put evidence-centered design or stealth assessments to report on a dashboard student mastery of 21st century skills such as systems thinking. And these students seem excited, right? But it's actually a very boring game. Many games like this are boring because they're task-oriented, and your reward for completing a task is a more complex or difficult task, and so on and so on. And that's actually not how commercial games are created. Commercial games are created using a different model. One is called MDA, and it means mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics. And they're designed backwards, so the player has an emotional resonance with the game. Or this one, this is the transformational framework. And in a game, we should look at not just what the computer can pull out from data, which is fine, but that's not the full picture of assessment. In the transformational framework, for instance, instead of teaching you how to read, the game should teach the player to want to read. In a citizen science game, it shouldn't teach you with graphics how to be a citizen scientist. It should encourage a child to go out and become a citizen science, to do citizen science. So we're not quite there yet, I think, with where assessments are as far as being in a black box of games, because it precludes the teacher and it precludes what the student should be transformed to do.
Excellent. So one thing I think that would be important to clarify before we go much further is, what is assessment? How do we think of assessment? Because there are many different angles to look at assessment. We have assessment of student, assessment of teacher. So I'd like to hear from each panelist and to get an overview of how they conceive of assessment. And maybe I'd like to hear from a few members of the audience to understand how they are using assessment or how they think of assessment. So perhaps Tobias can start at the other end. How do you conceive of assessment? How does assessment play into your practice, Tobias?
Very good morning to all of you. Nice to be here on this panel. I hope we have a fruitful discussion over the 54 minutes that are left. A short introduction of myself first. I'm currently head of Education Research and Innovation Policy at the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise. The Confederation of Swedish Enterprise comprised of 50 different member organizations consisting of Swedish companies. It's all the way from industry until services, high-tech and low-tech companies. And we also have a background, as was mentioned here before, as a politician, as a member of parliament, and also as a minister of higher education and research. And I think that, what someone asked, what is your kind of contribution to this panel? And sometimes you ask yourself that as well, of course. But I think that I can contribute with the company and also policy perspective, and also maybe a little bit of an overall political academic perspective. I also have a PhD in political science from Uppsala University. And because I also think that a lot of these problems that we address at this conference has to be solved in the intersection between politics, business and academia. You know, a lot of these challenges we talk about in the world today, the climate change, the demographic situation, what kind of role the education should play in solving those problems. All these are things that I think have to be solved in this interesting intersection. So Paul asked, and I just want to say also that I think it's important to say that companies, if they're given the right circumstances, can and will be a very important driver for change in those instances or those aspects that we discuss here today. Paul asked about the assessment, and I think you could divide the assessment issue, so to speak, into two categories from my point of view. Of course, the first one is what are you going to assess, and the second one is how to assess. And if you just say something about the what question, I think in many countries, Sweden, Europe, India maybe, and other countries, we assess a lot of those traditional skills that we learn in school. And of course, that will be valuable and important also now and also in the future. But I think we also have to assess other aspects of what students do in school and also what students do outside school. I think it's fair to say that critical thinking and abstract thinking and analytical thinking will be ever more important from now on and into the future, because we have not only that we have a labor market that is changing rapidly, but also have a world that overall that is changing rapidly. And if you want to adapt to those changing circumstances, I think it's very important that you know critical thinking, that you know analytical thinking, and you know this abstract thinking. That is how you can adapt to a world that is ever more changing. So I think we have to promote those generic skills even more. And we also see that among a lot of companies, modern companies that want to recruit people, that they say that, of course, we want them to have skills, the basic skills, but we also need them to have those generic skills, because then they are very interesting to hire, and that we can also develop them in our different companies. So that was something to say about the what question. The how question is, of course, also very important. And I think we are in many countries moving towards using digital tools when it comes to assessing more and more frequently. We have that in our country. We have a discussion now about assessing, have standardized the national tests that we do digitally, of course for efficiency, effective reasons, but also to have fairness so that we can compare students all over the country. And I know that this is of course something that is thought about in many countries. And of course also to use the digital technology when it comes to administration and using the same, maybe the same software all over a specific country or region. I think that is also, of course, very important. And so I think we have just started this digital revolution in the school system. Of course, this has to be done in a strategic way, so that we use the digital tools in a strategic way, so we can see the real good effects from it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To discuss his view on assessment and how assessment has played into his practice and career here in India.
I think the best analogy I can use for assessment is like an airplane trying to go from one place to another. So did you know that an airplane is off course most of the time on its trajectory? So it's actually not headed where it's supposed to be going because of various conditions, right? There are winds, there are other aircraft in the airspace, and learning is pretty much like that. So maybe we are clear enough about where we want to get to, but there are so many conditions in the classroom. So assessment is a process of continuous course correction. So I need to get here, where am I? So what course correction do I apply? And mixing this up a bit with my own experience, how I came into assessment and the different kinds of assessment. So today I am a co-founder of an organization called GenWise. GenWise runs specialized programs for children trying to connect the needs of the world of the future with what's happening today. So we run very interesting programs on be it storytelling or systems thinking, complexity, design, whatever. So in our work at GenWise, we are in classrooms face-to-face with students. So the kind of assessment we most commonly employ is actually a lot of informal questions. So while you're teaching, do you ask a question which allows you to get an insight into what the child understands? Unfortunately, a lot of us, we tend to ask questions, the answer to which is already there. You know, we've said something before and we ask for that and students repeat that, we think they've learned. But there is an art in asking a question which does not give away the answer, but gives you information. So at GenWise, we use assessments like that. We use assessments for small groups of say 20, 30 students. But today a lot of the things I want to talk about are actually from my work before GenWise. So from 2005 to 15, I worked for an organization called Educational Initiatives, which was looking at assessments at a larger scale, maybe an entire school. So there is one kind of insight you get in the classroom when you ask a question, but there's another kind of insight you get when, say in a school, you conduct an assessment and you find that, hey, let's say there are 90 kids in 3 different groups, 3 different sections in a class, and one section is doing great in algebra, the other is not. Right? So can we go? So this is now a clue into what is working, what is not working. So can we get teachers to observe each other's classes? Can we see what their approaches are? So when you start getting larger and larger school, district, state, nation, you have in some ways an opportunity to build a different kind of knowledge base. Because sometimes when you work with a group of students, you do not know if it is a cultural issue, if it is something in their environment which makes something easier to grasp or more difficult to grasp. So at Educational Initiatives, I've worked with a lot of different assessments of learning outcomes at national level, state level, teacher assessments of their pedagogical capability, their subject knowledge, video assessments of how classrooms function, of learning misconceptions, and we can talk about some of these as we go along. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. So, colleagues, is that assessment is evidence of learning, fundamentally. How many of you are teachers? Please raise your hand if you are a teacher. School administrator? Student? Good. Policymaker? Excellent. So assessment is evidence of what the student's doing at the classroom level. The type of work that Tobias and Vishnu are doing is they are finding evidence of success in classrooms over regions and measuring success of teachers in the practices that they use under the conditions in which they're teaching. So with assessment, to find evidence, there are a number of different strategies and instruments that can be used to gain evidence of your students' learning. And my informal sense is, and I ask you to participate as my Indian audience, do you think that you are using in India, or at least within the region or relevant to your own practice, a wide range of instruments to measure evidence of student learning? Can I get a hand? I'm seeing a lot of this. Yes.
So what you're asking is a very specific question. I'm going to give a general answer and we can meet outside the room sometime. So you're saying that the goals of the two groups might be different. The background context is different because adults probably already are, working and they're doing something. So I'm sure the program, when you have designed it, the program itself is different, right? So I think the question to answer is, what would success look like for the adult literacy group? What would success look like for this group? And to build an assessment, sometimes you don't get assessments right the first time around. So one of the things which is good practice in assessments is to do like a pilot assessment. So to do it with a handful of students, see how they're responding and tweak it. So that's a generic answer and we can speak in more detail, yeah. And you've spoken about, yeah, and this is also like more summative benchmarking assessment, but maybe we should broaden the field first before we get into specifics, yeah.
So perspectives, one as a former classroom teacher and one as a pre-service teacher educator. Yeah, there are multiple types of assessments, right? So there's formative assessments, right, which are those checks for understanding that everybody should have, right? And those are generally should be low stakes. So they can be playful, they can be an exit ticket question, they can be open-ended. Then there are these summative assessments, which could be assessments on tests or on project-based learning and those sorts of things, right? But it is considered, of course, best practice to start with the assessments first. Start with what this child should be knowing first, and then work backwards. Much like my example of games, that's how good games are designed, but that's also called understanding by design and lesson planning. So it's a tricky thing because in the United States, for instance, we're finding that teachers actually don't have a strong literacy of assessment and data analysis because that's not generally what they're doing, right? But that's what we need to increase on to make sure it's aligned. What you are assessing is what you want the child to actually be knowing, because those can easily be misaligned.
Matt makes an excellent point. I'd like to just consolidate that before I take another point. It is that if it's not clear, formative and summative assessment is a very important strategy that if you're not using in your practice is really a fantastic way in order to better prepare your students. An example of formative assessment is giving a test that doesn't count for marks, right? So you're being forgiving of the child. They get to practice at low stakes. Formative assessment is taking a piece of writing, giving them feedback on the writing, giving them the piece of writing, letting them make the corrections, and then handing it back for marks. Those are best practices in education. However, I am very sympathetic that in some cases it could mean extra work for very busy teachers. And but at least to practice a philosophy of getting evidence of learning that it's not always worth marks as a prelude to getting marks is a very good practice to service your students. Okay, I saw a few more hands go up. Yes?
I have two questions. But before that, I would just like to tell you the context. So when it comes to global citizenship education, we are talking about transformative learning and transformative assessment. But those who are practicing global citizenship education end up doing cognitive assessment. So it's a lot easier to do cognitive assessments than doing, say, non-cognitive assessments, perhaps behavioral and also when it comes to skills. So my question to the panelists is like, how do you look at assessments when we are talking about rethinking assessments? So do we look at assessments only as a way of testing, look, this is where you stand, or as an experience for a child where the child is learning something and you're parallelly you're trying to assess. So the mindset with which we go for assessments, how do we bring that in regular assessments? So that is one question I have. And two, if you can share the kind of research or the kind of developments that have happened in the domain of non-cognitive assessments. So what is the progress? If you can just share with us, it would be great.
Excellent. Do any of the panelists want to take that?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. What's your name? Yeah, so what Aryan is saying is that when we talk about, say, human flourishing or something in the 21st century, we are now talking of even more complex skills, right? We're talking of collaboration, of creativity, and so on. And this is not like measuring if somebody has learned algebra or fractions, but this is more important. So yes, I do agree that it's harder to assess these things, and one of the difficulties is that we are not entirely sure what we are saying when we mean these things, right? So when I say collaboration, do I mean that, I'll be nice to you and I will listen to you? Does it mean that I will speak up? Am I willing to have a difficult conversation? Because that too is part of effective collaboration, right? So, in my opinion, and I do think there is some work, and we can talk about a bit of that, though I don't think it is mature to the extent of really being able to say that this is where you stand on this. And it's not just education providers, but large companies have been doing this. When you hear about these, capability maturity models of an organization, of people maturity models in HR, they are attempting to do this. So what I want to say is that the first step in assessment, when you say that what is it that we should assess, what do we mean by collaboration or creativity, let us try to assess it. This is a very important step because it forces us to have a discussion on what this means. So I think assessment plays a big role in even having a very, very clear dialogue on this. Otherwise, we think we're agreeing on something, but if you're not going to collect evidence of understanding and have a debate on that, we're not going to get anywhere. In some small ways, I have been involved in some of these studies where we've tried to assess this. I can, share links later. For example, in 2010-11, as part of educational initiatives, we had done this study called Quality Education Study, where we attempted to assess children on their values and attitudes. So we actually had questions without a correct answer. These had 4 options with no correct answer, which about, I think, 80,000 or 100,000 children across the country took this test. And that did tell us some interesting things. For example, one of the questions asked, when is it okay to throw garbage on streets? Right? So there was this picture of somebody throwing garbage right on the street outside. And the 2 options, I think there were 3 options. One said that if others are doing so, right? The second option said if there is no garbage bin. And the third said it's never. So one of the interesting insights which came from this was, and the same question was given to grade 4 and grade 8 children. And the grade 4 children, many more of them, I think about 35% of them felt it was never okay to throw garbage on the street, whereas the grade 8 children, about 10% less said that. So many more grade 8 children felt that if others were throwing garbage on the street, it's okay to do so. So it was a bit of a clue as to, maybe as children grow older, they see what you're doing more than, what you tell them is the right thing to do. So there are ways to go about this. There are the study called TALIS, which is a teacher assessment study. Maybe Tobias can talk about other studies. So there are things happening, but I don't think there is a wide consensus that these can be measured very accurately and how to go about doing so.
Tobias, did you have a comment on that?
Yes, thank you for a very interesting question. And I also want to just pick up not only what you said, but also what Paul said here earlier on, that of course assessment can be used for different reasons. Of course, I think we often think of assessments as something that should be the basis of giving grades to students. But of course, you also can use assessment as a part of the learning process. I think that was what you said before. I think that is what lies in your question. For example, and if you think of the opportunities that the new digital technology gives us, for example, you can imagine a situation where you're a teacher and you have a class, you are going to teach mathematics, some important things that you want to teach to the kids. You want to teach them how to combine the different figures, and you can see them. You can have all the students on computers, and you can see them in real time solving the different problems. And of course, that improves the quality, and you can give instant feedback to the students. That is the kind of assessment, of course, that the students can solve the problems. You can give an instant feedback, and you can also learn as a teacher how your pedagogic skills turned out, because I 40% missed my explanation how to solve this kind of problems. I have to adapt to the next lesson. Maybe during the same lesson I have to try to be better, or to the next class that I meet teaching the same thing. I've tried to do it in a different way. So I think assessment also have not only to offer think about assessment as a basis of grades and these formal things, but we also should think of assessment as something that improves quality of education and also improves quality of teachers, and teachers learn what the teachers do.
And if I could speak to this notion of reflective practice, which is often missing in reflection, particularly when we get to digital tools. One of the most popular ones in the U.S. and in Britain and around Europe is called Kahoot. And Kahoot is this online game show quiz, and kids have to answer quickly on their phones, and then you get all this data that you could export to Excel or to Google Sheets. And it's okay, right? It's okay for review, it's okay to introduce content, but it also is rewarding who's the fastest at clicking a button, right? And that's not a 21st century skill, I don't think. So reflective practice is really important, such as something simple like asking a child to write down on an index card, how would you describe this lesson to a friend? Or something that triggers higher order thinking. Rank or list the top 5 things that you are still wondering about from this lesson. And those could also be deployed with paper or digital tools. For instance, Paul here was participant C in my dissertation, and when he taught with video games, he used things like Google Docs and asked students questions, and then he could just see it on his computer in real time, right? Those are a little more labor intensive, but if you want to know, like a goal of incentive, you want to know if what you're teaching is known by the student, the best way to do that is not by just clicking buttons, but by reflection.
So thank you for that. And because I think your question really drives to the heart of what we're here to talk about. We're here to assess human flourishing. And one thing that I'd like to plant, I want to plant a seed with our Indian educators, is that, for example, in my province, we give numerical grades. These are the grades that count to get into university. These are the grades that the students stress about, that creates competition, all that aspect of education. But we also provide feedback on their learning skills. Are they organized? Do they manage themselves responsibly in class? How do they relate to other students in the class? But those are not given grades. They're given evaluations of excellent, good, needs improvement, or satisfactory. And so one thing to think about in terms of using what is a formative assessment, because that type of evaluation of your students doesn't come into play, is you will produce better students when students become more mindful of their skills in class. So if you have a student that begins being very disorganized at the beginning of the year, instead of yelling him and saying, you should be more organized, that typically has very little effect. You can give a little note, you can over the course of the term write 1 or 2 sentences. I've noticed that you're not very organized. What can you do to improve this situation? And have the student write something for them to become more mindful and to produce, and this is a way that they can flourish, that they become more aware of the skills that they need to succeed in the types of assignments and the types of evaluations that actually count for grades. So it's something that any teacher can do. You don't need a formalized system, but to devoting some time to think about all the other social emotional elements in the class and the elements that set them up for success, and to have them, for you to take notes, to evaluate it in your own way, can be extremely useful for the success and future success of your students. Yes, sir. Yes, could somebody pass this gentleman the microphone, please? Right.
Yeah. I'm Ravi. So since it's on rethinking assessment, I have a question. So should the assessment still be grade-wise, age-wise, or should it be more of skill and ladder-based?
Sorry, could you repeat that one more time?
So should the assessment be grade-wise, like all grade 3 students giving the same assessment, or should it be based on more of skill-based or ladder-based? Like if a student is good in something, he can go up the ladder faster.
Right.
So it's more of having a portfolio over a period of time rather than passing grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. Instead, it can be like building the portfolio and at the end knowing what are the skills and what are the competencies he is having after some age.
Yeah, you speak my language. I think that's an extremely progressive view of education, and I think that's exactly the way that we should go. To be personally, I think that I'm of the school that dividing students according to grades, assessing them according to grades, is really undermining the fact that you can take 20 kids that are the same age and they're completely different kids. And that some are ready for more, some are ready for less, and our schools should better articulate those individual elements. Yeah, so I completely agree.
And at a granular classroom level, and teachers, I know, don't have a lot of time, right? But teachers do need to define what constructs are valued and important to them. And those should be reflected in instruments they are using to assess, such as rubrics.
Excellent. So I have received a note that we will end in 10 minutes. So we will continue to take questions until that time. Yes?
So my question is that who is powerful into rethinking the assessment? For example, so I used to be a consultant to a couple of education NGOs. Donors want quick results. So they have very definite idea of, how much readability did you improve. They are not looking at critical thinking or social emotional learning or a long-term outcome of it. So who is powerful? Politicians have a very short-term election coming up. Before that, they want to pitch up numbers of how many people did not drop out of school. Or like those numbers and the way we are trying to rethink assessment do not align at all. Unless people who hold the power, that who can aim at rethinking assessment, I don't think that we will be able to achieve a lot.
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, I don't think assessments is going to solve that, because what you're talking about, I think there are two issues. One is short-term thinking and looking at immediate political gain and so on. And we know from experience that change does take some amount of time. What I have done personally, what I've tried to do with bureaucrats or organizations which have pushed for these kind of metrics to be achieved into 3 years or a short time frame. One is to sort of educate people on the gaming that happens, right? Because the system will game itself to give you any outcome you want, right? So you want 1 crore toilets? Yes, we'll show you that there are 1 crore toilets. Who's going to go and see the toilets exist after 3 months and there is water in the toilets? And same thing for learning. So one is I try to educate people on how human behavior works. And the other thing, see, now thing is we need to, now if there is a political motive there, there's very little one can do about it. But even the sincere bureaucrat needs a way to measure things, right? So you cannot say that, hey, this cannot be measured, it's going to take longer, so please allow me, because what is the guarantee that this intervention is working? So I think the negotiation needed here is, so let us say we agree on a process. So if we say that children will learn better if teachers know what students cannot do, if teachers are giving tasks which allow children to think, if teachers are waiting for students to answer questions, not giving away the answers. Suppose we can agree on a theoretical model, then we could put in place certain process indicators, like what I mentioned, right? And we track these process indicators initially. Initially, we don't put too much focus on the ultimate outcome, so that we know that are we on track. So we have to have a way of giving donors or bureaucrats or even politicians, we have to give them a way of being able to see are we on track. So that's the, I think the best approach we can take here.
Tobias, do you have any thoughts on the matter?
Well, I think I agree. Of course, politics is for some people strange business. But I think Vishnu is right here that if you want to make change, of course you have to be able to show results also during the way, because of course we have this, politicians, they have to be elected, re-elected for maybe every 4 or every 5 years. So they have to be able to show results to the citizens. So of course, if you go to convince politicians to go in a specific direction, of course you have to be able to show results on the way. So I think that is important. And well, apart from that, I think I agree with Vishnu in many points.
Excellent. Anamika?
My question is, how do you make space for differentiated assessment within the same class? Is that even possible? Are there tools that allow for differentiated assessment?
Great. I think, Matt, is that something you want to take on? Can we get the image of the rubric? It's that chart with all those words.
While she's getting that up, there are different types of rubrics. There are standards-based rubrics, there's single-point rubrics, and all of these rubrics break down assignments, right? For instance, project-based learning is different than projects because you should be grading the process more than the project. You shouldn't give a single-point grade to what the student turns in. It needs to be broken down. And within the rubric itself, which is, this is an English rubric here, within the rubric itself, you can break down categories and subcategories, or even create simple differentiated rubrics for different children based on their levels of competency.
One of my English classes, how many teachers here use rubrics for their assessment? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Great, so it's good to see that. If you don't, because at the very beginning of my career, I didn't. It was the Wild West, and I would just give numbers at the end of certain items, and it would be sometimes arbitrary. The importance of using this system, and this is a very busy rubric, there's a lot of information here, they don't have to be this complicated, and there's many you can find online, is that it gives a student a very direct idea of where they went wrong. It very specifically looks at where they've made errors. With mathematics, it's not as important because that's very easily discernible within the mathematical scheme. But for those of you that teach in the humanities, that teach in writing or history or this type of thing, these are extremely useful as an instrument of evidence to show, because assessment is not just about us taking information from the student, it's ideally for the student to discover how they can be better, right? And if you just put a number at the end of the page, there's very little opportunity for the student to reflect on what they're doing. One very progressive practice, particularly for older kids, is to have them design their own rubrics together and then make some adjustments so that way they're thinking about how they're going to be assessed for any particular assignment. Any further questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, hello, I'm Mayank from another foundation. I'm heading the expansion division of Shiksha Initiative project. So I just have one question. Why do we actually need assessments in terms of when the student is growing? Why can't we have something like that? Because assessments, I feel that we are judging ourselves when we are taking assessments, not exactly the student. So if I say that a government is taking routine assessments, 4 assessments per year, what exactly they feel like? How they are going to assess the students in that case, because students are very different in the classroom. So it's better that why can't we have some kind of what you're talking about, game-based assessments, and just try to instill the confidence and the skills inside the students.
Well, you know, game-based assessments are a black box and they're fixed, right? So if you get a game-based assessment, you can't do anything about it. Teachers know their students the best. The way I was taught to be a teacher is to assess every single child by the end of the lesson. With always formative assessments, and never saying, oh, 3 students raised their hand and asked questions during a class, so I feel like I nailed it. Mic drop, and the class was awesome, right? But you didn't. You only asked 3 students, not every person in the room, right? I should never, ever get to a point where I am giving a test to students and I have no idea who's going to fail or who's going to pass the test. I need to know that. That's best practice as a teacher, to do all of the checkpoints along the way, right?
So that means we should have assessments after a specific age or maybe after a specific class. That person comes, that individual, that children are reaching class 5 or class 4, then we can start the assessments, what do you call the summative assessment, from class 6.
All grades have assessments, all levels. When my son was, I don't know, he still asks these questions. Like, we read him a story, and he parrots back the assessments that he gets all the time. What was your favorite part? Who was your favorite character? It's so ingrained in learning that I could not imagine teaching without nonstop assessment. Because how do I know that there's any learning transfer? It's really all about transfer. So you can play a game all you want, but it does not mean that when you're done playing the game that you can now do a math worksheet and solve problems. You need to assess that transfer. And the only way to do that is to have sometimes multiple assessments. You know, sometimes 2, 3 different types of formative assessments in the same class.
It is with a broken heart that I have to announce to you that we have to bring this session to a close, because I think there's a lot more fruitful discussion to be had around the topic. I think in summary, because I think what's important when you come to these sessions is to walk away with something that you can bring back to your practice. And I think in summary, many of you, particularly teachers, might start thinking about how to use use your creative abilities to create a variety of instruments of assessment of your students, measures of their success or places to improve, and that not all of them necessarily need to be worth marks and grades, and to start putting pressure on the system to start making politicians perhaps see, by using examples from other countries, et cetera, that there are a variety of ways to measure success in school systems, and to start changing the culture from the bottom up. I thank you very, very much. And I thank our panelists.
So just to remind you that we will have AMA